The BBQ in the suburbs should have been normal. Jessica laughed, touched his arm, performed a mask of connection. But Mark remained calm, detached. His stillness made her frantic. Jessica's panic grew, her gestures desperate, her control slipping. Mark sat at the kitchen table in their aging house on the north side of Chicago, the humid July air pressing against the windows and walls. Sunlight filtered through the half-drawn blinds, falling in slanted stripes across the worn tabletop, illuminating the unfinished pasta and the condensation dripping from the wine glasses. The air smelled faintly of garlic and lingering heat, the quiet punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic outside and the slow, rhythmic ticking of the kitchen clock. Jessica's eyes settled on him with a cold, measured gaze, precise and unflinching, as though she were inspecting an object on a shelf. In that stillness, her words landed, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the mundane atmosphere of the evening. Mark froze mid-motion, his hand hovering over the glass of water, fingers tense, knuckles whitening. He studied her face carefully, searching for a hint of jest, a flicker of warmth, some sign that it was a cruel joke, but found nothing. Only indifference and calm certainty. The moment stretched, a silence so thick it seemed to press against his chest, and he felt a shift inside himself, a clarity emerging from the weight of those words. His hand slid to his ring, the simple band he had worn for years, once a symbol of shared promises, now suddenly alien and heavy. He removed it and let it fall onto the table. The metallic clink sounded unnaturally loud in the stillness, reverberating through the kitchen with a force that words could not match. He rose slowly, each movement deliberate, and walked toward the bedroom. The hallway felt narrower than usual, the walls closer, the air heavy with the residue of their shared life. He opened the drawer where they had kept photographs, ticket stubs, postcards, and letters, all the tangible remnants of years spent together. He paused, his hand hovering over the objects, and then closed the drawer without touching a single item. They remained inert and silent, yet he understood that he no longer belonged to them, that a part of himself had already withdrawn. Mark lingered for a moment in the bedroom, feeling the subtle, almost imperceptible change in his chest, the release that came not from anger or grief, but from the recognition that nothing could be undone. He turned back toward the hallway, the sound of his footsteps muted against the old wooden floors, carrying with them the quiet declaration of a life that had ended, unmarked by shouts or confrontation, leaving only the echo of a man who had chosen clarity over chaos. The next morning, Jessica moved through the house with a practiced ease, as if nothing had changed. The sunlight poured through the kitchen windows, casting warm rectangles onto the linoleum floor. She brewed coffee, the rich aroma filling the air, tapped on her phone to check messages and notifications, and flicked on the morning news, letting the familiar voices and images anchor the space in routine. Every gesture was deliberate, an attempt to recreate normalcy, to reclaim a rhythm that had once defined their shared life. Mark remained still, watching her from a distance for a moment before moving through the kitchen with careful, measured steps. He did not take the coffee she offered, nor did he glance at her, his movements precise and unhurried across the worn wooden floorboards. The keys, his wallet, and his phone rested on the counter in plain sight, left unhidden, exposed, a silent testament to his detachment. Each small action, or deliberate inaction, seemed to stretch the quiet further, filling the house with tension that had not existed before. Jessica's hands worked methodically, placing dishes in the dishwasher, folding a stray towel, organizing the counter as if the act itself could restore order. Yet the energy she had once commanded seemed to falter in his presence. Each effort, each carefully orchestrated motion, was met with the same calm indifference. Mark's silence weighed more heavily than words, his control over his own responses creating a new set of rules she had no authority to bend. Slowly, imperceptibly, the house shifted. The invisible boundaries had changed. The balance of power had moved, and Jessica, despite her outward composure, began to feel the quiet erosion of the control she had once taken for granted. Mark moved with intention, his every action measured precise, leaving nothing to chance. He carried out mundane tasks, pouring a glass of water, adjusting a stack of papers, walking to the window to look outside. But each gesture, each pause, was laden with meaning. The simple, unspoken refusal to engage in the familiar patterns of their shared life created a space where Jessica's efforts, once unchallenged, now only highlighted her own lack of influence. The silence became his instrument, shaping the day and the house itself, imposing new rules without a single word. By mid-morning, the house was filled with the quiet weight of routine interrupted. Jessica moved as she always had, but her actions no longer elicited response, and in that void, she began to recognize the shift. Mark's presence, calm and deliberate, conveyed a subtle but unmistakable truth. The equilibrium had been broken, and the authority she had assumed over him had quietly dissolved. Every motion, every breath, every measured step he took was a declaration of independence, a silent restructuring of the household, and a warning that the life they had known had already begun to unravel. Mark stopped performing the routines that had once silently structured their life. The gas tank remained half empty, bills went unpaid on the kitchen counter, and packages from online orders accumulated on the front porch, unclaimed and untouched. Each neglected task was a subtle shift, unnoticed at first, but steadily reshaping the rhythm of the house. The ordinary systems that had once run seamlessly through his quiet labor now lay exposed, disordered, and incomplete, leaving gaps that Jessica felt with increasing intensity. She moved to fill those gaps, attempting to maintain an appearance of order and stability. She cooked dinners she knew he preferred, tidied the living room, folded laundry with methodical precision, and rearranged misplaced items. Every gesture was deliberate, a silent effort to restore the balance she believed their household depended on. Yet Mark observed without interference, his eyes noting her movements, her rising tension, the subtle tightening of her hands, the quickened pace of her steps. His inaction spoke louder than words, letting the spaces she tried to repair reveal the anxiety she could no longer hide. With each passing day, Jessica's panic became more visible. She glanced at him more often, her gestures more calculated, as if the success of her actions depended on eliciting a reaction he no longer provided. Friends visiting for dinner noticed the awkwardness between them, the brief pauses that had once been invisible now standing out sharply. Colleagues at work commented on her distracted demeanor, and even her family sensed the underlying tension during phone calls and gatherings. The shift was subtle yet undeniable, a quiet unraveling that moved through every interaction, exposing fractures that had been masked for years. Mark's silence had transformed into a precise instrument of influence. Each neglected task, each deliberate refusal to engage, became a signal of autonomy, of detachment, of the restructuring of control in the home. Jessica attempted to restore what had been lost, but every effort met calm indifference, and with each indifferent response, the house itself seemed to betray her. Light switches left on, chairs slightly askew, stacks of papers untouched. Each detail emphasized the shift in power. The familiar world that had once defined their life together was dissolving. Walls that had once enclosed warmth and routine now echoed with emptiness. The habits that had structured their days and smoothed over their conflicts were gone, replaced by the quiet assertion of Mark's presence without participation. Jessica's attempts to maintain order became performances, rehearsed and futile, increasingly revealing her vulnerability to anyone who watched closely. She moved through the house as she always had, but the house no longer responded to her. The collapse of familiar life was no longer hidden. It was reflected in every room, every unfilled chore, every deliberate omission. Mark's deliberate inaction was more than withdrawal. It was recalibration. The rules had changed. What had once been invisible labor now stood in stark relief. The household's fragile equilibrium had shifted, and Jessica's panic became the mirror through which the new order was visible. Each day, the ordinary routines, now neglected, made the quiet fractures undeniable. The collapse of their familiar world was not announced with drama or confrontation. It unfolded in silence, observed, measured, and undeniable. Over the weekend, they drove to the suburbs for a barbecue at friend's house. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and folding tables laden with food and drinks. Jessica moved with careful precision, laughing at jokes she hadn't heard, reaching out to touch Mark's arm, holding his hand lightly across the picnic table. a performance meant to convey connection and normalcy. Every smile, every gesture, every tilt of her head was deliberate, a rehearsed attempt to mask the tension that had begun to define their relationship. Mark remained calm, his face neutral, his movements measured and restrained. He accepted the hand she offered but did not squeeze it, allowed her gestures to pass without acknowledgement, maintained the same quiet composure he had carried through their house for weeks. Each deliberate pause, each unreactive glance, set a subtle boundary that Jessica could neither cross nor ignore. The contrast between her visible effort and his quiet indifference created a tension that hovered like heat over the backyard, felt by everyone present even if unspoken. Their friends began to notice the imbalance. Casual glances caught her exaggerated gestures, her nervous laughter, the way she seemed to anticipate his reactions, and his deliberate stillness. The difference in their behavior was a mirror reflecting the shift in their private world for all to see. Her attempts to recreate the ordinary, to maintain the facade of a happy couple, were nullified by the quiet authority he carried with every step, every measured breath. As the afternoon wore on, the pressure built silently. Jessica's movements became slightly more frantic, her laughter a fraction too loud, her attention splitting between him and the surrounding friends as if to prove her place in both worlds. She glanced toward him repeatedly, searching for affirmation, for any sign that her performance was effective. Mark gave none. His calm presence absorbed the tension, his measured detachment amplifying the discomfort that Jessica could not contain. Jessica escalated her efforts to regain control, filling the days with calls, messages, and questions aimed at testing Mark's attention. She moved through the house with a heightened urgency, entering spaces he occupied uninvited, rifling through papers and belongings, trying to assert a presence that could no longer influence him. Every attempt to provoke a response was met with stillness. Mark remained composed, his movements deliberate, his face neutral, his reactions measured or absent entirely. There was no anger within him, no desire for confrontation, only the calm observation of a shifting dynamic that he no longer needed to articulate. As she pressed further, her composure began to fray. The meticulous mask she had relied on for years, the confident smile, the controlled gestures, the sense of effortless command, started to falter. Her hands trembled slightly as she rearranged objects he ignored. Her voice tightened when she moved through the rooms, and the habitual ease she once projected dissolved under the weight of her own panic. Each misstep, each failed attempt to elicit a reaction, amplified the quiet dominance Mark maintained through inaction. Outside observers began to perceive the change. Friends noticed her restless energy, the small signs of tension that contradicted her words and forced smiles. Colleagues remarked on her distracted presence, the slight sharpness in her tone when discussing trivial matters. Even family sensed a subtle dissonance, the small cracks in her habitual performance. Mark's silence refracted her panic outward, making it visible not only to him but to the world around them. The effort to maintain the old equilibrium became futile. Every gesture intended to restore control only revealed her vulnerability further, each intrusion into his space underscoring the loss of influence she had once taken for granted. She confronted the quiet reality she had avoided. Her authority over him was gone, and the life she had relied upon to validate her position was dissolving in plain sight. The illusions that had sustained her confidence, the belief in her unchallenged control, the certainty that the household and its routines would respond to her whims, cracked and fell away. Panic grew steadily, visible in the tightening of her posture, the repetitive checking of his actions, the accelerated pace of her movements, and the increasingly frantic attempts to anticipate his next step. Mark did not intervene. He did not scold or explain. He simply existed in measured calm, allowing her own behavior to betray her fears. The mask she had perfected over years shattered, leaving her exposed to the consequences of her words and choices, visible to herself and to the eyes of others. The collapse of her carefully curated image was complete, her confidence replaced by the raw, undeniable weight of anxiety and vulnerability, and Mark's quiet detachment became the lens through which the truth of her fall was revealed. Mark had prepared for his final departure with meticulous care. The suitcase he had packed weeks earlier sat by the bedroom door, carefully arranged and balanced, containing only what he would need and leaving behind everything that once tethered him to a life that no longer belonged to him. The house was still, thick with the residue of tension and anticipation, the air heavy yet quiet, as if holding its breath for the inevitable moment. Every surface bore traces of their shared past: photographs on shelves, old tickets, mementos of vacations and anniversaries. But the weight of those objects had shifted. They no longer anchored him. They existed as inert reminders, powerless against the clarity he had found. He moved slowly through the rooms, pausing at the hallway mirror to see himself reflected back in the soft morning light. The kitchen counters held the untouched dishes, the living room still bore signs of her attempts at order, and the staircase rose silently, unaltered, yet marking the path he would soon take. Jessica stood at the top of the stairs, frozen for a moment, a silent figure holding on to the remnants of a world she could not reclaim. Her body tensed, hands gripping the railing, but her eyes told the truth. She was helpless against the inevitability of his exit. Mark paused at the base of the staircase, allowing the silence to stretch, to press against her awareness, to fill the space with the weight of consequence. He turned once, casting a calm, measured gaze upon her, emotionless, unshaken, the expression of a man who had already left in every way that mattered. The ring, left deliberately on the kitchen table, caught the light as he passed, its presence a quiet testament to the ending of promises and the finality of the life they had shared. He walked to the front door without haste, the sound of his footsteps soft against the wooden floors, yet each step marked a decisive departure. The door closed gently behind him, the click echoing in the empty house, and he did not look back. The engine of his car started with a low hum, and he drove away, leaving the neighborhood behind, the streets bathed in summer light, the cityscape stretching toward the horizon. The distance grew steadily, the physical separation reflecting the emotional release he had cultivated in silence. Days later, a message arrived from a mutual acquaintance, reporting that Jessica had tried to restore what had been lost, to regain control and salvage the remnants of their life together. But the opportunity had passed. The consequences of her words, the weight of her earlier actions, and the vacuum created by his calm detachment could not be undone. In his departure, silence had become both instrument and shield. It was not dramatic, not vengeful, not explosive. It was complete. Every moment, every step, every measured pause had carried truth and autonomy, leaving her with only reflection, regret, and the undeniable reality of what had ended. The quiet held its power to the last instant, marking the conclusion of their story and the beginning of freedom. A freedom forged not in confrontation, but in the serene authority of a man who chose to leave without chaos, leaving the world, and her, with the lasting imprint of the choices she had made.